Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Independent Thought. My name is Desmond Price. For all of the returning listeners, thank you so much for coming back after that break. I know it's been a few weeks since I put out an episode. Thank you so much for checking back in with me and the podcast. If this is your first time, welcome. And just to kind of give you a little preview of how things go here on my podcast, this episode is broken into two parts. This first subject here will be different than my second subject, which will be with a guest. And my guest and I will have a conversation that's completely unrelated to this one, which I will touch on a little bit later once we finish this subject. But first things first, we are here today to start talking about the Boy Scouts of America and what is the largest child sex abuse case in U.S. history. And when I first came across this story, it was July 1st or 2nd, just a few weeks ago. I was on Twitter, in the news section of Twitter, and buried towards the bottom of the news section was one article from Bloomberg that said, the Boy Scouts of America have reached a settlement with sex abuse survivors. And underneath that title, it said that this is the largest child sex abuse case in U.S. history. And my mind immediately went to, wait, what did you say? You said what? The largest child sex abuse case in U.S. history? How is that possible? How is it possible that this is happening and that no one's covering it? I thought I was losing my mind. And for those of you who follow me on Instagram, you probably saw a piece of me losing my mind as I shared this story on Instagram. And then I proceeded to ask people to also share it, which I saw that a bunch of you did. Thank you so much for doing that. But the question really remained for me, which was, what exactly is happening here and why is it not being covered? And so that really more or less preceded how I knew that this would be the first episode of season 4 here. I needed to understand how a story this giant could be swept under the rug to the point where I could barely find any coverage on it. And any of the coverage that I did find from this year literally was just focusing on the fact that a settlement had been reached. There was no talk about why a settlement was reached or what exactly where these claims came from, how extensive they were, why exactly this went on for so long. Like none of that existed in any of the articles that I read. And even going back, I came to find out this story has been around for a long time. But even going back a couple of years, outlets like NPR and the New York Times, they covered it technically, but it was only about like a page or so worth of coverage with barely any details. And so the thought kind of occurred to me that this is absolutely ridiculous. Nothing this significant should be getting undercovered to this extent. Not in this age, not in the age of ultimate media exposure where we have a 24-hour news cycle. And it just made absolutely no sense to me. But for the coverage I'm going to bring to you today, I want to give you the sources that I received this coverage from. We got information here from NBC, the CBC News, ABC News, the Associated Press, and then there were great pieces done by Time Magazine and The Intercept. Those last two particularly did great work on this subject. I can't highlight them enough because they did the work that I felt like everyone should have done. But we'll get to them in a little bit here. The first thing that I want you all to know is that we're going to cover exactly what happened, how long it happened, and what's happening now. So 85,000 people, let me say that again, 85,000 people have come forward claiming that they have been sexually abused by members of the Boy Scouts of America. 85,000, at least. Those are the people who have come forward. Of that 85,000, only apparently 60,000 or so filed lawsuits against the Boy Scouts of America, which, again, was the only piece of coverage that I could find, was just the lawsuits. That's all that was being covered. So with a story of this magnitude, the question that I really wanted to know was, what exactly is going on here? Because just for comparison's sake, when you heard about the Catholic Church and all of the accusations that came against them, there was approximately 10,000 accusations against the Catholic Church. 10,000 compared now to over 85,000. So the question that I really had to ask myself is, okay, like how did this happen, and where do we start talking about this? Because the disgusting thing to me is that not only did this happen, but even today, the Boy Scouts of America still have over 1.1 million children who are enrolled within that organization as of 2020. And so in an era of cancel culture, I can't wrap my head around how that's even still a possibility. But let's talk about exactly what happened on their watch. The first thing that I want you to know is that the allegations that come against the Boy Scouts of America are not really isolated in any way, shape, or form. In fact, these allegations span decades. In fact, these allegations go all the way back to 1944. They range from 1944 to the most recent one that I saw was in 2018. And during that time, there were 7,800 alleged abusers that we know of. And those 7,800 that we know of abused at least 85,000 children. Again, that we know of. People who actually came forward, because of course not everyone's going to come forward. We know that the nature of that when it comes to assaults like this, not everyone's comfortable in explaining what's happened to them. It's not exactly something that you want to relive, some of the worst moments of your life. And the thing about it is that when we talk about this, I don't want to go into too many stories, because at first I wasn't even sure if I wanted to cover any of the particular just like accounts of what some of these people went through. I know that it can be triggering for some people, and it's just frankly also not things that people want to hear. But I felt like these people had the bravery to come forward and speak about what happened to them and talk about their personal accounts. And so I also feel like it's important to honor these people and to let everyone know what they experienced, so that we in some way can get a better understanding of what exactly happened to so many people in this country. And so with that being said, I just want to kind of point out that a lot of these claims did come in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but again, they were widespread from the 40s up until the most recently. But let's talk about some of these victims' accounts. So first of all, there were two brothers back in the 1960s from the Seattle area, and they detailed being abused by a scoutmaster. They said that the scoutmaster lived down the street from them, was friends with their family, and would routinely have him and his brother over to his house into his, in his backyard, where the scoutmaster would pitch a tent. And so the parents thought that they were just doing normal Boy Scout related activities. But instead, what was happening was the young boy and his brother were routinely being abused. And apparently the one victim accounted the fact that this started for him when he was 6 years old, and that it went on for nearly a decade. And unfortunately, stories like this, as I was going through this research, were very common, and not just common, but seem to be happening in all different parts of the country. not just over in Seattle, Washington, but also in Massachusetts. A 60-year-old Massachusetts man was he was interviewed by Time magazine and asked to remain anonymous because even still to this day, he couldn't actually talk like open. He didn't want people to know what had happened to them all these years later. But he accounted the fact that he and several boys in his troop were assaulted and raped over a dozen times in the woods by scoutmasters while they were teenagers. And still to this day, he cringes if someone he doesn't know gets too close to him. And that is, one of the things that I, want to touch on before we get too much further into this discussion, is that not only did these atrocious things happen, but people have had to deal with this trauma for the rest of their lives. I mean, when you experience trauma like this as a child, it sticks with you through to adulthood. I mean, trauma experienced, especially by children at that small of an age, not only can it affect you into your adulthood, but it can actually alter the shape of your brain and your brain's chemistry as you're growing as a young child. And I'm going to bring on a clip of a child doctor who explains exactly how trauma like this affects our brains at that young of an age. Here's the clip.
Over time. In the short term, as a pediatrician, we may see regressed developmental milestones. So a child who was once potty trained may now start wetting the bed. And they may become more regressed in their social interactions, or they may outwardly express aggression towards other people. And in the long term, we can start to see the systemic response of the body to those stress hormones. So that's where you start to see heart disease or obesity or depression or anxiety. Kids who are experiencing toxic stress younger are higher risk of suicidality. So there's real lifelong consequences. And the interesting thing is that the earlier we intervene, the better chance we have at impacting their life trajectory.
And so not only do children have to deal with those kinds of effects going later with them into life, but also there's the role that plays in another fashion, something that probably doesn't want to be acknowledged or discussed, but is very true, which is another study that's done by the National Library of Medicine concluded that their data supported that young boys who are victims of sexual abuse are significantly more likely to become victimizers themselves, calling it the victim to victimizer cycle, which is obviously something that could be prevented had these people not ever been abused in the first place. And this abuse took so many different forms over the vast many of accounts that were presented over the years. Some victims accounted being assaulted hundreds of times, and that the scoutmasters would get them drunk and then assault them. And apparently this was very commonplace for not just this particular victim, but for so many victims across the country. Here's a clip talking about that.
According to the LA Times analysis, the alleged abuse occurred all throughout the country and followed a now familiar pattern.
The abusive scout leaders would often groom the kids, buy them alcohol, show them porn, and then the abuse would start.
The newspaper said that in many cases, the Boy Scouts did not report the alleged abuser to authorities. The alleged victims suffering in secret.
And obviously, the next question that comes to your mind is, well, did the Boy Scouts know what was happening? Were all of these children being abused without there being any kind of reporting being done? Were the Boy Scouts largely unaware of what was going on? How much did they know of this happening during this time frame where all of these assaults were taking place? And so I want to read to you another testimony from a man named Edward Pitson, who spoke with Time magazine about some of the encounters that he experienced. It says 58 years ago, a scoutmaster who had taught him skills like how to use a compass and how to light a campfire said he was going to teach Pitson about sex. The scoutmaster invited Pitson, who was 12 at the time, to his house and asked him to lie on his bed. The man assured the boy that he had seen other Boy Scouts naked. Quote, "This is the normal way to learn about sex," unquote. And then he went on to say, "But don't tell your parents what I'm doing. They wouldn't think you're mature enough to, they wouldn't think that you're mature enough. They wouldn't understand." And then the man proceeded to tell him dirty stories and then tried to pull down his pants. Afterwards, Pinson remembers pulling up his pants after a few minutes and walking out of the room, to which his scoutmaster called after him calling him a baby and trying to make him feel guilty for leaving. But Pinson recalled just wanting to go home. Later on, Pinson did telling his parents what happened, and they went to a bishop at their local church because that church had sponsored that same Boy Scout troop. And the scoutmaster was quietly removed, but to Pitson's knowledge, there was never a police report filed. And apparently this isn't the only kind of story like this, of course, because, with this many cases of abuse happening over the years, you would think other people would have tried to report this, report their abuses, to report being just victimized by all of these people. And I'm going to present to you now another case of a man in Idaho who talks not only about his abuse, but also his attempts to report said abuse after many instances of being abused by the same person. Here's the clip.
And I just, didn't expect being scared to death that the guy next to you isn't going to sleep. And you don't know why he's not going to sleep, and his clothes are like coming off. And he's way bigger than you, and then he's pressed on your body, and he starts masturbating your body with his body and starts touching you and doing all these things that you were going to save your whole life for your dream. And it's happening by this crazy, crazy, horrible man. I can't think how in the world, like, a big person could think so selfishly to just, to do this to a child is just beyond any comprehension. I hate that place.
Adam is at first, as a young boy is in that situation, horrified and, feeling guilty and did I do something wrong? And pretty quickly finds his moral compass. It's an extraordinary moral compass. Adam goes to camp leadership and says, "Hey, Brad is molesting kids at camp." Camp leadership brushes him off.
And he says, "Okay, they're going to take care of it. Don't worry about it. Everything's fine. Just go back to everything. Everything's normal." But nobody went to stop Brad. I came back to him and said, "This is not working. You have to do something. You have to do something." Finally, I asked to talk to his supervisor. So they put me on the phone with this guy I've never met. I'm like, "What's his name?" And they're like, "Oh, this is Kim Hansen." So I'm on the phone with Kim Hansen, and I'm telling him what's happening. And Kim Hansen's like, "Oh, that's horrible. That's horrible what's happening. But we don't want anybody to know about it. If people know about it, nobody will come back to scout camp, and you'll ruin it for everybody. No one will ever come here anymore. Don't tell anyone." That's what's next thing. He said, "You got to promise me you won't tell your parents. You won't tell anyone. We're going to take care of this. We'll be the ones that take care of it." That's what he told me. And Brad was still sexually abusing kids up here. And I said, "This does not work." And I said, "I'm calling the police." And I called the police. The day that the police arrested him, he confessed to 24 victims, and others he didn't even remember their names. That should have been like the end of the story, where the good guys came in and fixed it. But that, unfortunately, was just the beginning.
And so the short answer to this question that I had previously is yes. The Boy Scouts did know exactly what was happening. And they not only knew about it, but they kept files of it to some extent. They called them the P files, also known as the perversion files. So they kept files of everyone who had been documented about allegedly molesting or abusing or raping young boys, but they never, ever reported these things to the police. Not once, not ever. And so they allowed these predators to walk free. Yes, some of these people were fired from the Boy Scouts, but they didn't go to jail. The Boy Scouts were more concerned with protecting their image, protecting their brand, their company, than actually going after these predators and making sure that they could not do this to anyone else again. And this went on for decades. It wasn't until 2010 where Carrie Lewis, a person who was victimized in the 1980s, successfully sued the Boy Scouts of America. And during the trial, he was able to tell that his abuser, Timur Dykes, not only abused him, but had abused 17 other boys back in the 1980s. But the worst part about all of this is that Timur Dykes actually, not only was he abusing all of these boys back in the 1980s, but the Boy Scouts knew about this abuse back in the 1980s. So they had knowledge of these abuses going all the way back to 1983, and again, never did anything. Thankfully, once Carrie Lewis came forward in 2010, Timur Dykes was then sent to prison and has been there ever since, thankfully. And also on top of that, it was during this time that a judge was able to order the Boy Scouts of America to publish said perversion file so that the public could see the name of all of the people who were on this list. And that is when the floodgates really started opening, because then was the first time that these stories were finally really coming out to the public. That's when the Los Angeles Times got a hold of this and they made that list public so that people could see it, and they referred to it as the Boy Scout files. That's when lawsuits first started, like really started to come down the pipe a little bit. And the problem is that even though some of the traction was starting to gain there, people were starting to understand what was been happening in the Boy Scouts for all along, is that a lot of the abusers who had molested so many children over the years weren't even on these P files. In fact, some of the lawyers for some victims in this particular case said that 90% of the names of their clients' abusers were not even on these P files. And that's because, of course, not everyone who was abused actually reported this to the Boy Scouts themselves. And I'm sure there were some cases where the Boy Scouts just didn't even file any of these reports in their so-called P files. And so while not every name of an abuser is in these P files, it's still a good thing that these P files do exist. Because uncovered in these perversion files, we were able to see that the Boy Scouts of America were, yes, documenting some of these abuses, but again, not sending people to jail, but rather just kicking them out of their organization. And at a rate of which they were actually letting go of one person every 2 days for nearly 100 years. That is how many people were cycling out of the Boy Scouts because of allegations of sexual assaults and rape. Again, people who did not face jail time. It is absolutely insane to me that corruption on that level could go on for that long and that nothing was being done about it. Nothing was being done about it. It is absolutely incredible to me. And it wasn't just happening during those times. Again, like I was saying, this is pervaded up until just recently. In fact, one 17-year-old from Michigan said that back in 2009, when he was 7 years old, he said that, he was being molested even then, and that he's only coming forward now because of the success of the Me Too movement, and that he figured that he would share his story now so that it would be helpful for anyone who is still going through this. And that is something that I just want to talk about here for a second, because so many people are coming forward now because they finally feel as though that they finally have the ability to do so. There are so many of these people who just kept this abuse to themselves for so many years. When Time magazine was going around and interviewing Pitson and the man from Massachusetts who chose to remain anonymous and various other people, quite a few of these scouts ended up saying that they waited decades to come forward, but they were just now feeling inspired because of they saw people who were accusing the church of coming forward, and people in the entertainment industry, like the people who accused Harvey Weinstein and Kevin Spacey, and what was happening in sports with Larry Nassar and all of his abusers, all of them coming forward. So now these people who had been abused by the Boy Scouts were finally feeling like, hey, maybe I too can come forward and talk about what happened. And thankfully, since these people have come forward, now several states have extended their statute of limitations on sex abuse cases, which has now opened the door to more legal claims. So that in and of itself is definitely a good thing. But the question that really comes is, have the Boy Scouts actually changed at all? Have they changed anything about their operating procedures? They claim that they have. They've come out recently and said that they've now instituted criminal background checks because, you know, that's just something that you do 50 years later after abuse claims start, not when they immediately start happening decades ago. But now that they've been caught, of course, yes, that totally makes sense now. But not only have they started implementing criminal background checks, now they've also added a 24-hour hotline, which is called the Scouts First Helpline, which allows people to report misconduct. And so in 2018, a Maryland mother tried to use said helpline. Apparently, her 14-year-old son was sexually abused in the year 2018. She called this helpline, but was informed that they were not going to refile a report, so that if she wanted a report filed, she had to call the police. So the mother then tried contacting a camp director to explain the abuse, to which the director said, "Boys will be boys." So that was just happening just 3 years ago, after the case that came out in 2010, after thousands upon thousands of people are coming forward. Even now, there are still children being sexually assaulted within the Boy Scouts, and they are still not taking it seriously. It is absolutely criminal to me. But now that we've talked about all of these things, now let's talk about the lawsuits, because it is absolutely incredible to me that, again, the lawsuits are all that's being talked about in the mainstream media for those people who actually are even covering this. And this is all at the same time while the Boy Scouts are hiring lobbyists to push against certain laws that would allow these sexual assault claims to continue to come forward, you know, because they are afraid of criminal cases coming against their organization. And they should be. They should absolutely be afraid of that. But instead of potentially facing all these things, now the Boy Scouts of America have filed for bankruptcy. So they have filed for bankruptcy as of February of 2020, of last year. And as of a few weeks ago, have now reached a settlement where they are now paying out nearly 60,000 people who have come forward. And that is basically where this story stands right now. The Boy Scouts of America are using a tactic of bankruptcy to essentially getting to cap the amount of claims that they're going to pay, and so that they can avoid being essentially financially ruined and cut their losses basically where they are right now. And this comes after insurance companies back in 2018 refused to pay these claims that they were receiving hundreds and hundreds of, because the insurance companies argued in court that the Boy Scouts of America could have reasonably prevented this abuse. And of course they could have. But the question I have, not for the Boy Scouts of America, the question I have is for the rest of us. Like, what exactly are we going to do with this story now? Because this is this is unconscionable. It's unconscionable that this story has been swept under the rug. It's unconscionable that the Boy Scouts of America still exist, that they're able to still have children enrolled within their ranks, that they believe that just paying people off is going to be an adequate way of dealing with the thousands of people who've had their lives permanently altered by this. People who might have committed suicide, people who are experiencing depression, people who have forever been just scarred by this. It is insane to me that basically they're being paid off to the tune of maybe $10,000 per person is about what these claimants are going to receive. And that's just the people who have come forward. Again, that's not even accounting for everyone who has seen this. Where is their justice? I mean, like, where is the justice in all of this? I mean, where are politicians with this? Why are they not coming forward? The Boy Scouts of America are a federally chartered nonprofit who have to report to Congress annually. For years, they did not report any of these abuses going on. Why is there no criminal punishment for this? I truly don't understand it. And for the media, I honestly say this is a black mark on all of them, because there is no categorical good reason why we as a society do not know more about this subject, do not know more about this story. Rightly so, when allegations came out about Kevin Spacey, we heard a bunch of testimony and there was a bunch of reporting on it. The same thing happened when Larry Nassar was found out to be assaulting people at Michigan State. When Harvey Weinstein, when we found out about all the gross abuses that he was doing to women in Hollywood, when we heard about Jeffrey Epstein last year and all the people that he trafficked to and from his island over the years, when we hear about Bill Cosby and all the things that he did in the 1980s and the 90s and the 2000s, and even with the Catholic Church, like whenever these things are documented, we all know exactly what happens, and there is a plethora of reporting. There has been barely anything scratching the surface on this story. It is absolutely unbelievable. And so I ask all of you who are listening to this now to please go out and share this information. I will be linking below in the episode description the Time article that I was really impressed by, as well as a documentary that was done by The Intercept that just incredibly done. It was about 30 minutes long. It's on YouTube. It's called The Church and the Fourth Estate. And I highly recommend their take on what exactly happened to people what happened to some of these victims. And so with all that being said, please everyone, do your own research on this story. As I always say, like, don't let me be your last line of research for any particular topic. Please go out and check out this story and research what happened to some of these victims, and please share this information with people. Thank you so much. With all that being said, now we're going to transition to our guest segment for this episode. But before we do that, we have a few words from our sponsor, Bathing Beauties Beads. So please make sure that you check out that sponsorship ad that will be coming right after this, and I'll see you with my guest segment here in a few minutes. Welcome back from the break, everyone. Thank you for sticking with me through this entire episode of Independent Thought. First, I want to thank my guest, Destiny, for coming on to the episode today. It was really awesome having you on, and I really do appreciate you taking the time to share with us that story. And I hope that for those of you who are interested, you will definitely check out the links below and, check out more of what's going on with those stories that we were referring to within the guest segment. Climate change is an issue that is affecting us all, and something needs to be done. It's like something needs to be done. I'm currently breathing in wildfire smoke that is consistently getting into my apartment no matter what I do. Something needs to change, but there'll be more on that on a different day. If you were interested in seeing the video version of my talk with Destiny, you can join my Patreon to see the video version. Every member of my Patreon will be able to see not only the video of my talk with my guest today, but every guest segment that I have this season will have a video attached to it. And those videos will be available on my Patreon. So you can sign up below in the link and you'll be able to see all of those videos. And I want to say thank you to all of my current patrons. I really do appreciate all of you for supporting me and this podcast. And for those who are interested in other semi videos, my YouTube channel will be getting some more video content in the not too distant future. So check out my YouTube channel as well. The link for that is also below. So check out my YouTube channel. As I'm closing out this episode today, the first thing that I want to say is that I am incredibly rusty right now. I did not realize it until about halfway through this first segment when I was talking about the Boy Scouts. I'm stumbling all over my words and I am getting some of my facts mixed up and I was forgetting some of the things that I wanted to say. And it might take me an episode or two to kind of get back into the just the natural flow of podcasting. So bear with me a little bit as I'm fumbling around with my words. I do appreciate everybody who, doesn't think too poorly of me after all of that. But some of the things I want to kind of tell you about what's coming up with season 4, I'm really excited about it. I'm excited about the variety of guests that are coming on, the variety of discussions we're planning on having. I am planning on having an additional episode every month from July throughout December. And each additional episode will be a political candidate who is running for office across this country. I don't want to say exactly who's coming on just yet because, I don't want to jinx it. You never know when some people might back out, and I haven't recorded all of these just yet, but I have officially recorded one. So coming out on July 29th, William Compton, who is running for the 2nd congressional district in the state of Kentucky. I have already recorded that episode. It will be out on July 29th. And if you are interested in hearing about him and his campaign and his platform, please check that episode out. Again, the video version of that episode will be available on Patreon. And so I'm going to have lots of guests on this season, lots of different topics. And also, I am really excited to get some panel-based episodes going. I have a decent list of topics that I'm brewing right now, and I have a pretty decent list of potential panelists to come on. So I'm definitely excited for when those episodes eventually come through. But the final thing that I want to say before we check out today is, well, there's actually 2 things. If you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast, please, because just why not at this point? But also, I know that right now it's summertime. It's July. People don't really want to think about politics. We're kind of like on hopefully the other half of a pandemic, but with the Delta variant, it's kind of surging. That's a little bit up in the air right now. And people are out having fun. They're going to concerts. They're going on trips. They're doing a bunch of things that have nothing to do with politics. And most people are kind of checking out of the news cycle right now. And I get it. I absolutely get it. I just checked out for the last 2 months. That's why I took my break. I checked out. I completely get it. And taking a break is necessary. It's necessary for your mental health. It's necessary just for synergy all around. However, I will also ask that you don't take too long of a break, because there are so many issues in our country that still need to be addressed, and they get addressed through all of us giving them the attention that they deserve. We're only a few months removed from the 2020 election, which, rightly so, during that campaign cycle, candidates, not just in the general election, but in the primary, talked about all of the different challenges that our country has faced, that we are facing, and that we have been facing. And the pandemic has done nothing but exacerbate all of these different issues that we were facing as a country, as a society. And I just do not believe that the time is now to be not paying attention to these things. I mean, currently, if some of you have been following me on Instagram, you know that I am continuously saying that Joe Biden has not proposed any climate legislation up until now. I'm going to keep talking about that because the last time I checked, during the campaign cycle, every single member who was running as a Democrat in the primary did nothing but talk about how climate change was an existential threat. I remember them all doing town halls with the Sunrise Movement. And now there's no climate legislation being proposed, even though the Democrats have control of the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. How does that make any sense when this was such an existential threat? In fact, the only thing that has been proposed is that there should be tax credits for electric vehicles, which is basically just a giant giveaway for Elon Musk, one of the richest people in the world. That's insanity. So we as a society need to continue to put pressure on these people, because if we do not, they will get complacent and they will not get things done. So thank you all for checking out this episode. Thank you all for staying engaged in politics. And please, let's all keep a sense of vigilance throughout these next couple of years, because if we do not, I have a sneaking suspicion that we're going to be having the same conversations in a couple of years that we were having a couple of years ago. And that's just really not how progress is supposed to work. Thank you for tuning in. See you the next episode.